You know, in our digital world, sometimes silence is the scariest sound. That sudden out-of-nowhere outage of a website or a service you rely on. It's not just an annoyance, it can be a sign of a huge invisible war being fought online. So in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on that conflict and demystify one of the internet's oldest and most powerful weapons, the DDoS attack. Oh, we've all been there, right? You're in the middle of something important, trying to log in, maybe buy something, or just scrolling. And then, bam, nothing. The site is just gone. Now, look, there can be a bunch of reasons for that, but a really common and very disruptive culprit is a coordinated digital assault. And this really captures the whole idea. It's called a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS for short. And its goal is super simple: to make a website, an app, you name it, completely unavailable to the people who are actually trying to use it. But how does it really pull that off? To really get a handle on the threat, you have to understand the main goal of the attack. See, it's not about stealing your data or breaking into a system like you might think. Nope. The only goal here is pure, simple disruption. We're talking a complete and total shutdown of a service. So here's the key. Every single server out there has its limits. It's got a finite amount of bandwidth, a certain amount of brain power, or CPU, and a fixed amount of memory. A DDoS attack is basically a digital stampede that's designed to use up every last drop of those resources, leaving absolutely nothing left for you, the legitimate user. But here's the thing. This threat is not new at all. It's been evolving for decades, literally growing from a simple idea on paper into a massive global problem. Let's just take a quick look at how these attacks have gotten so much bigger and way more sophisticated over the years. You know, what's really wild on this slide is just the sheer escalation. It starts as just an idea back in 1974. By the 90s, we see the first real attacks, but they're pretty small by today's standards. And then the game completely changes. The distributed part of DDoS, that's the first D, comes into play, using these huge networks of infected computers called botnets. I mean, look at that jump. By 2016 with the Mirai botnet, we're not talking megabits anymore. We're talking 1 terabit per second. And it's not just about raw size. By 2022, attackers got smarter, learning how to exploit the fundamental rules of the internet like HTTP/2, letting them cause massive chaos with way less effort. And this chart just puts that growth into a really stark perspective. From that record-breaking 1 terabit per second attack in 2016, we've seen the peak attack volume more than triple in just 7 years. It hit a staggering 3.4 terabits per second in 2023. I mean, that scale is just almost impossible to wrap your head around. And it's not just about how big these attacks are, it's how often they're happening. In 2023 alone, there were almost 20 million documented DDoS attacks. This isn't some rare, once-in-a-while event anymore. This is a constant, daily part of life on the modern internet. But here's where the story gets a little more interesting, a little more complex. Because the modern DDoS battlefield isn't just about who can throw the most traffic at a target anymore. The attacks themselves have gotten a whole lot smarter. Okay, so this is a really critical difference. The old-school way was just brute force. Clog up the internet pipes with so much garbage traffic that nothing real can get through. But the modern attacks, they're often more like a surgical strike. They use way less traffic to target very specific resource-heavy parts of a server, like its processor or its memory, causing it to crash without ever actually maxing out the network connection. It's sneaky. And what makes these modern attacks even tougher to stop? Encryption. Now, don't get me wrong, encryption is amazing for our privacy and security, but it creates this massive blind spot for the people trying to defend the network. Since they can't easily peek inside that encrypted traffic, it becomes incredibly hard to tell the difference between a legit user and a malicious attacker. A low and slow attack is the perfect example of this stealthy approach. Instead of a huge flood, an attacker sends these tiny little bits of data, but really, really slowly. This doesn't set off any alarms, but it forces the server to keep a connection open, just waiting for more data that never really comes. The attacker opens thousands of these connections, lets them hang, and just quietly drains all the server's resources until it finally just gives up. So you're faced with these huge, sometimes incredibly sneaky attacks. How in the world do you even start to fight back? Well, one of the most fundamental and really powerful tools we have is something called rate limiting. It's actually a pretty simple idea. Rate limiting is just a set of rules that says how many times someone or something can make a request in a certain amount of time. If you go over that limit, you're temporarily put in a timeout. That's it. The absolute best way to think about it is like a bouncer at a really popular nightclub. The bouncer's whole job is to control the flow of people coming in, right? They let people in at a steady pace to make sure the club doesn't get dangerously overcrowded. Well, rate limiting does the exact same thing for a server. It makes sure it doesn't get totally overwhelmed with requests. And the benefits are huge. It stops one bad guy from hogging all the resources. It makes it almost impossible for hackers to brute force passwords by just guessing over and over and over. It ensures fair access for everybody. And maybe most importantly, it's a direct defense against those sneaky resource exhaustion attacks we were just talking about. So how does it actually work in practice? Well, a really common way is called the token bucket algorithm. Just imagine every user gets a little bucket with, say, 100 tokens in it. Every request you make to the server costs 1 token. If you use up all your tokens, you just have to wait. The system slowly adds tokens back into your bucket at a nice, steady rate. This lets you have small bursts of activity, but it prevents those sustained, overwhelming floods. It's simple, but it's incredibly effective. But as it is with pretty much everything in cybersecurity, it's never quite that simple. This is a constant arms race, a back and forth between the attackers and the defenders. So putting rate limiting in place isn't just a set it and forget it kind of thing. You've got to have a smart strategy. You want to layer your protection with different limits, per second, per minute, and per day, to stop different kinds of abuse. And the really smart systems can even adapt on the fly, tightening those limits automatically when they think an attack is starting. That's how you build a defense that can react in real time. And this right here is the final and maybe most crucial point. Rate limiting is absolutely essential, but it is not a silver bullet. A really clever attacker can still do a ton of damage while staying inside the rate limits you've set, especially if they find a flaw in the application's actual business logic. Which really just leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Rate limiting is the shield. It's fantastic at protecting against that brute force, overwhelming attack. But the next frontier in this cyber war, the real challenge, is defending against that quiet, intelligent attacker who doesn't even bother trying to break down the front door. Instead, they just find the one unlocked window that everybody else completely overlooked.